The ground shook for 300 miles in every direction when the massive ship fell from the sky. In the red heart of Australia, where nothing grew except scrub brush and ancient rocks, a crater appeared that was deeper than any mine and wider than most cities. The impact sent clouds of dust into the atmosphere that turned sunsets purple for weeks. Dr. Emma Rivers felt the tremor in her laboratory in Sydney, nearly 2,000 miles away. Every seismograph on the continent went crazy at exactly 3:47 in the morning. By dawn, satellites showed something impossible buried in the Australian outback, something that was definitely not a meteor. The ship was enormous. When the first helicopters arrived at the crash site 12 hours later, they could barely see from one end to the other. The hull was made of some kind of metal that seemed to shift color in the sunlight, going from deep blue to silver to black. Strange symbols covered every surface, and parts of the ship still glowed with an inner light that made Geiger counters click nervously. Military teams from 6 different countries arrived within days. They set up a perimeter around the crater and tried to figure out what they were looking at. The ship was clearly artificial, clearly from somewhere else, and clearly damaged beyond belief. Massive holes had been burned through the hull by weapons that left edges smooth as glass. Whatever had attacked this vessel had been trying to destroy it completely. The breakthrough came on the 4th day. A team of engineers found an airlock that was still functioning. The door was 20 feet tall and covered with those same strange symbols, but when Dr. Rivers touched a panel that was glowing green, it opened with a sound like wind chimes. Inside, they found the aliens. The Veleth were tall and thin, with skin that looked like polished copper and eyes that held too much intelligence. They wore armor that seemed to be made of the same color-shifting metal as their ship, and most of them were dying. The corridors of their vessel were filled with the wounded and the dead, survivors of a battle that had clearly been hopeless from the start. Commander Dex was the highest-ranking officer still alive. He was ancient even by Veleth standards, with scars covering his arms and a voice that sounded like grinding stone. When the humans found him in what looked like the ship's command center, he was trying to repair a console that had been completely destroyed by weapons fire. Through translation devices that the Veleth themselves provided, Commander Dex told the humans about the war. His people had ruled 12 star systems for over 3,000 years. They had built an empire that stretched across a section of the galaxy with fleets that could destroy planets and technology that seemed like magic to younger species. But then the Kresh came. The Kresh Dominion was older and larger than the Veleth Empire. They had been expanding across the galaxy for 10,000 years, absorbing every species they encountered. Some became slaves. Others were wiped out completely. The Kresh themselves were warriors born and bred for conquest, with ships that could fold space and weapons that could crack moons in half. The war between the Veleth and the Kresh lasted for 50 years. At first, the Veleth held their own. Their technology was advanced, their soldiers were brave, and they had the advantage of defending their own territory. But the Kresh had numbers. For every ship the Veleth destroyed, 3 more took its place. For every world they held, 2 more fell to Kresh invasion fleets. In the end, Commander Dex and his fleet were the only survivors. 200 vessels had become 50, then 20, then 5. When the last battle was fought over the Veleth homeworld, only his ship remained. The World Breaker cannon, their most powerful weapon, had been damaged in the fighting. Their engines were failing. Their crew was dying. So they ran. The journey to Earth took 6 months of limping through space on failing systems. Commander Dex chose this planet because it was far from any major trade routes, far from Kresh territory, and inhabited by a species that had barely learned to split the atom. If his people were going to die, at least they would die somewhere. The Kresh would never think to look. Dr. Rivers spent weeks talking to the dying Veleth, learning about their technology and their war. The ship itself was a marvel of engineering. Its computers could process information faster than anything humans had ever built. Its weapons could destroy targets from halfway across a solar system. Its engines could fold space itself, allowing travel between stars in days rather than years. But it was all broken now. The Valeth had tried to repair their ship, but too much damage had been done. They lacked the materials to rebuild their exotic matter generators. Their manufacturing systems had been destroyed in the last battle. Even if they could fix everything, there were only 200 of them left, not enough to crew a vessel designed for thousands. Commander Dex watched the humans exploring his ship with something like amusement. These primitive creatures were fascinated by everything they saw. They took pictures of every console, scanned every piece of technology, and asked endless questions about how everything worked. They reminded him of children discovering fire for the first time. The old commander knew what was coming. The Kresh would eventually trace the energy signature of his ship's engines. Maybe in a year, maybe in 5. But they would come. When they did, they would find this primitive world and destroy it just to make sure no Valeth had survived. These humans, with their crude rockets and simple nuclear weapons, would burn alongside the last remnants of his people. But Dr. Rivers surprised him. As he lay dying in the ship's medical bay, systems failing one by one, she sat beside his bed and made him a promise. "We will continue your fight," she said. Commander Dex laughed, a sound like breaking glass. How could these barely evolved mammals continue a war against an empire that had crushed civilizations older than their entire species? But as consciousness faded from his ancient mind, he noticed something in the human's eyes, a hardness that reminded him of his own people in their younger days, a refusal to accept defeat that had once made the Veleth the terror of 12 star systems. Maybe, he thought as darkness claimed him, these humans were not as primitive as they seemed. The ship fell silent as the last of the Veleth died, leaving behind only their technology, their knowledge, and their war. But the humans were still there, still learning, still planning. In the depths of the vessel, teams of engineers were already beginning to understand how Veleth systems worked. In laboratories around the world, scientists were analyzing exotic materials that could change everything they knew about physics. The Kresh had destroyed the Veleth Empire in 50 years of brutal warfare. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had let one ship escape, and that ship had crashed on a world inhabited by a species that had never learned when to quit. 6 months had passed since the last Veleth died, and the Australian outback had become the most important place on Earth. What started as a crash site was now a sprawling complex of laboratories, workshops, and living quarters. Scientists and engineers from every major nation worked side by side, trying to understand technology that was thousands of years ahead of human knowledge. Dr. Emma Rivers walked through the ship's main corridor at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep again. The Veleth vessel was slowly coming back to life under human hands, but every breakthrough brought 10 new questions. The walls around her hummed with energy from power systems that human physics said shouldn't work. Emergency lighting cast. Strange shadows that seemed to move on their own. The work was happening everywhere at once. In the engineering sections, teams were rebuilding the ship's massive fusion reactors using a combination of Veleth designs and human materials. They couldn't create the exotic matter that the original systems used, but they could build something. That worked almost as well. The reactors they were installing were bigger and cruder than what the Veleth had used, but they produced enough power to run the ship's basic systems. Captain Maria Torres had been assigned as the military liaison to the project. She was a career officer who had commanded destroyers in 3 different conflicts, but nothing had prepared her for what she saw in the Veleth ship. Weapons that could vaporize mountains. Armor that could stop anything humans had ever built. Shield generators that created barriers of pure energy. But the humans were learning. In the weapons bay, teams of technicians were studying the Worldbreaker cannon. The weapon was massive, taking up 3 entire decks of the ship. When the Veleth had used it, it could crack the crust of a planet from orbit. The focusing crystals had been shattered in the final battle, and the power coupling had been completely destroyed. But human engineers were building new parts from scratch, using manufacturing techniques that the Veleth had never imagined. Dr. Lisa Kim led the team working on the ship's computer systems. The Veleth databases contained more information than all of human civilization had ever recorded. Star maps showing the locations of thousands of worlds. Technical specifications for weapons and ships. Most importantly, complete intelligence files on the Kresh Dominion. The Kresh were everything Commander Dex had said, and worse. Their empire covered 1/3 of the galaxy, with billions of soldiers and millions of warships. They had been expanding for 10,000 years, destroying or enslaving every species they encountered. Their technology was advanced beyond human understanding, and their military tactics had been perfected over countless wars. But they had weaknesses. The Veleth had been fighting the Kresh for 50 years, and they had learned how their enemies thought. Kresh commanders were arrogant and predictable. They relied on overwhelming force rather than clever tactics. Their ships were powerful but inflexible, designed for straightforward battles rather than complex operations. More importantly, the Kresh had never faced humans before. As the months passed, something interesting began to happen. The human engineers, working on the ship, started making improvements to Veleth designs. The aliens had built their technology to last for thousands of years, making it incredibly reliable but also incredibly complex. Humans simplified systems, made them easier to repair, and found ways to build them using materials that could be found on Earth. The ship's navigation system was a perfect example. The Veleth version used quantum processors that required exotic matter to function. The human version used conventional computers networked together in ways that achieved the same result. It was less elegant but easier to understand and much cheaper to build. Elder Nyx was the oldest of the surviving Veleth, and she watched the human work with growing amazement. Her people had built their empire by perfecting existing technologies, making small improvements over centuries of development. But humans approach problems differently. They looked at Veleth systems and immediately started thinking of ways to do the same job better, faster, or cheaper. "Your species frightens me," she told Dr. Rivers one evening as they stood in the ship's restored command center. "Why?" Rivers asked. "Because you consume everything you touch. The Kresh conquer worlds and impose their will. You study them and make them part of yourselves. In 6 months, you have learned things that took my people centuries to discover." It was true. Human teams had already improved the ship's engines, making them 20% more efficient than the original design. They had redesigned the weapon systems to be more accurate and easier to maintain. They had even found ways to make the life support systems work better in Earth's atmosphere. But the real breakthrough came when Dr. Kim's team finally cracked the encryption on the Kresh tactical databases. The information inside was incredible. Ship designs, fleet formations, command structures, communication codes, everything the Veleth had learned about their enemies during 50 years of warfare. The Kresh had 3 main types of warship. Dreadnoughts were massive vessels designed to bombard planets from orbit. Cruisers were smaller but faster, used for patrol duties and escort missions. Fighters were tiny one-person craft that swarmed enemy ships in huge numbers. Each type had specific weaknesses that Veleth commanders had identified. Dreadnoughts were slow and couldn't change direction quickly. Cruisers had weak rear armor to save weight. Fighters relied on their numbers and couldn't operate effectively if their carrier ships were destroyed. Captain Torres studied the intelligence reports with the same attention she had once given to enemy submarine movements. But this was different. The Kresh weren't just another human nation with similar technology and predictable tactics. They were aliens who thought differently, fought differently, and had advantages humans couldn't match. Yet, the work continued around the clock. Teams of engineers rebuilt the ship's damaged hull using human steel reinforced with Valeth composite materials. The result was armor that was stronger than anything either species had created alone. Weapons specialists installed human targeting computers in Valeth energy cannons, creating systems that were more accurate and faster firing than the originals. Most importantly, human strategists studied Kresh tactics and began developing counters. The aliens relied on formation fighting, with their ships supporting each other in carefully planned attacks. But formations were predictable. If you knew how Kresh fleets operated, you could position your own forces to exploit their weaknesses. Dr. Rivers stood in the ship's main reactor chamber, watching human technicians work alongside Valeth holographic advisors. The fusion cores were online and running smoothly, producing more power than any human-built reactor had ever generated. The engines were ready for testing. The weapons were charged and waiting. In 8 more months, the ship would be ready to fly again. Elder. Nix joined her at the observation window, looking down at the massive engines that would soon carry them to the stars. "When the Kresh come," the old Valeth said, "they will expect to find the remnants of my people hiding on a primitive world. Instead, they will find something they have never encountered before." "What's that?" Rivers asked. "A species that learns from its enemies and becomes stronger than them." The ship that had once been a Valeth refugee vessel was becoming something new. Part alien technology, part human innovation, and completely dedicated to a single purpose. The Kresh had destroyed one empire and thought themselves invincible. They were about to learn that humans had a very different approach to warfare. Where other species fought to defend their territory, humans fought to win completely. Where other species tried to match their enemies' strengths, humans studied their weaknesses and exploited them ruthlessly. The forge of humanity was heating up, and what emerged would be unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The alarm started screaming at 0400 hours on a Tuesday morning that would change galactic history forever. Deep space sensors detected the dimensional distortions first, massive ripples in space-time that announced the arrival of ships using fold drives. The signatures were unmistakable. After 18 months of preparation, the Kresh had finally found Earth. Admiral Sarah Hayes had been expecting this moment since the day she took command of the rebuilt alien vessel. The ship that had once been a broken Valeth refugee transport was now something entirely different. Humans had renamed it the Retribution, and every system aboard reflected their unique approach to warfare. Where the original had been elegant and efficient, the human version was brutal and effective. The command center buzzed with activity as technicians brought all systems online. The main viewer showed 3 massive shapes emerging from fold space at the edge of the solar system. Kresh dreadnoughts, each one the size of a city, and armed with enough firepower to reduce Earth's continents to glass. 12 smaller escort vessels accompanied them, cruisers designed to hunt down any survivors who tried to escape. Captain Maria Torres stood at the tactical station, watching enemy movement patterns with the cold focus of a predator. She had studied Kresh fleet operations for over a year, analyzing every battle the Valeth had recorded. The approaching formation was textbook standard. Dreadnoughts in the center, cruisers spread in a defensive screen, all of them moving toward Earth in a steady, predictable advance. "They're not even trying to be clever," Torres said. "Same formation they've used for 1,000 years." On the main screen, a communications signal crackled to life. The image that appeared was nightmarish even by alien standards. Admiral Vorth of the Kresh Navy looked like something from humanity's worst dreams. 8 feet tall, covered in natural armor plates, with eyes like black holes and teeth designed for tearing flesh. When he spoke, his voice sounded like metal grinding against stone. "Valeth survivors," Vorth said. "Your empire is dead. Your worlds are ash. Surrender now, and your deaths will be quick." Admiral Hayes stepped forward, her human face calm and composed. This is Admiral Hayes of the Terran vessel Retribution. You are trespassing in human space. Leave now or be destroyed. Vorth's alien features twisted into what might have been amusement. Humans? The primitive mammals who build toys from metal and fire? You dare threaten the Kresh Dominion? I'm not threatening you, Hayes replied. I'm promising you. The communication link went dead. On the tactical display, the Kresh fleet began accelerating toward Earth, weapons charging for orbital bombardment. Vorth had clearly decided that any species protecting Valeth refugees deserved the same fate as the original Empire. It was exactly what the humans had hoped he would do. The Retribution moved away from Earth orbit, taking a position between the planet and the approaching enemy fleet. To Kresh sensors, it looked like a single desperate ship trying to protect a helpless world. They had no way of knowing that hidden throughout the solar system, dozens of smaller human vessels waited in the shadows of asteroids and moons. These weren't the crude chemical rockets that Earth had been launching just 2 years earlier. Human. Engineers had built an entire fleet using reverse-engineered alien technology. Each ship was small compared to Kresh dreadnoughts, but they were fast, heavily armed, and crewed by humans who had studied every weakness in enemy designs. The battle began when the lead Kresh dreadnought fired its main plasma cannons at maximum range. Bolts of superheated gas that could vaporize mountains streaked across space toward the Retribution. But the human ship was no longer where the targeting computers expected it to be. Human pilots had studied the timing of Kresh weapons and learned to predict their firing patterns. The Retribution twisted through space with an agility that no Valeth ship had ever possessed, avoiding the plasma bolts by meters. Counterfire came immediately from the rebuilt Worldbreaker cannon, enhanced with human targeting systems and powered by fusion cores that produced more energy than the original exotic matter generators. The beam that lanced out from the Retribution was invisible until it hit its target. Then the lead Kresh dreadnought simply ceased to exist. 8 billion tons of alien warship vaporized in an instant, leaving nothing behind but expanding gas and the shocked silence of the remaining enemy fleet. Admiral Vorth had less than 3 seconds to process what had just happened before the real attack began. Human ships appeared throughout the solar system, emerging from hiding places that Kresh sensors had never detected. They moved in patterns that violated everything Vorth knew about space combat, using gravity wells and magnetic fields to change direction in ways that should have been impossible. The Kresh tried to respond with their standard tactics. Dreadnoughts formed up for concentrated fire while cruisers moved to protect their flanks. But human vessels didn't fight like anything Vorth had encountered before. They struck from multiple directions simultaneously, targeting specific weak points that Valeth intelligence had identified over decades of warfare. Captain Torres watched the tactical display with satisfaction as human pilots executed maneuvers they had practiced for months. Kresh cruisers were fast and well armed, but their rear armor was thin to save weight. Human ships approached from behind, using the cruisers' own speed against them. Plasma torpedoes slammed into engine sections, crippling ships that had been built to last for centuries. The second Kresh dreadnought tried to bring its massive weapons to bear on the swarming human vessels, but the targeting systems couldn't keep up. Human ships were too small and too fast, darting between the giants' weapons like mosquitoes attacking a bear. Precise strikes from human energy weapons disabled the dreadnought's gun turrets one by one, leaving it helpless and blind. Admiral Vorth found himself trapped in a nightmare that violated every principle of Kresh military doctrine. His empire had conquered 1,000 worlds, using overwhelming firepower and superior technology. But the humans weren't trying to match Kresh strength. They were exploiting Kresh weaknesses with surgical precision. The third dreadnought managed to destroy 2 human vessels with a lucky shot from its main guns. But the victory was temporary. The Retribution appeared above the Kresh flagship like an avenging angel, its rebuilt weapon systems charging for a killing blow. The Worldbreaker cannon fired point-blank into the dreadnought's command section. and Admiral Vorth had just enough time to realize that his thousand-year empire was about to learn what humanity meant by the word retribution. The battle lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. When it ended, 15 Kresh warships had been reduced to drifting wreckage, and not a single enemy vessel had escaped to carry word of their defeat back to the Dominion. The humans had lost 6 ships and 43 crew members. By any measure of space combat, it was the most one-sided victory in recorded history. Dr. Emma Rivers stood in the Retribution's medical bay, treating wounded human sailors, while Elder Nix tended to the few Violith observers who had chosen to witness the battle. The old alien looked at the human doctor with something approaching awe. "In 50 years of war," Nix said, "my people never achieved a victory like this. We fought bravely, but we always fought the Kresh on their terms. You made them fight on yours." Rivers nodded, checking the vital signs of a young pilot who had taken plasma burns during the final assault. "We learned from your mistakes. The Kresh are powerful, but they're predictable. They've been using the same tactics for so long that they can't adapt when someone fights differently." "What happens now?" Nix asked. Rivers looked out the medical bay viewport at the expanding debris field that had once been a Kresh fleet. In the distance, human salvage ships were already beginning to collect alien technology and intelligence data. Every piece of wreckage would be studied, analyzed, and used to make humanity's next generation of ships even more effective. "Now we hunt," Rivers said. "The Kresh have been expanding across the galaxy for 10,000 years, destroying everything in their path. It's time someone taught them what it feels like to be prey." The communication logs recovered from Kresh wreckage contained fleet positions, patrol routes, and supply bases scattered across dozens of star systems. The Dominion had grown too large and too confident, leaving their territory poorly defended, because no one had ever dared to attack them. That was about to change. The Retribution and her escort vessels prepared for humanity's first interstellar military operation. The species that had achieved spaceflight less than a century earlier was about to begin hunting an empire that had ruled the galaxy since before human civilization began. The Kresh had made one fatal mistake. They had given humanity 18 months to prepare, and humans had used that time to become something the galaxy had never seen before. Not just another species fighting for survival, but apex predators with technology, tactics, and a level of ruthless efficiency that would make the next few years very interesting for everyone involved. 2 years after the Battle of Earth, the name of humanity echoed through the galaxy like a curse word whispered in dark corners. What had started as one impossible victory had become a systematic campaign of destruction that was tearing the Kresh. Dominion apart star system by star system. Colonel Diego Martinez stood on the bridge of the Vengeance, watching the orbital fortresses of Kelthera burn in the distance. The Kresh homeworld had been protected by defenses that could destroy entire fleets, powered by the industrial output of a civilization that had conquered half the galaxy. Those same fortresses were now launching their missiles at the planet. Below, their targeting systems corrupted by human cyber warfare specialists who had turned the Kresh's greatest strength into their final weakness. The Vengeance was one of 12 ships in humanity's rapidly growing fleet, but unlike the Retribution, she was pure human design. Her hull incorporated alloys from 6 different alien civilizations that had fallen to the Kresh over the centuries. Her weapons combined energy projection techniques learned from the Violith with targeting systems based on Kresh military computers. Her engines used propulsion theory taken from the archives of the Zalani Republic, a species that had been wiped out 300 years earlier. Each conquered world had contributed something to humanity's growing arsenal of knowledge. The humans didn't just defeat their enemies. They absorbed everything useful and discarded the rest, becoming stronger with every battle. The assault on Kelthera had taken 3 days of careful preparation. Human intelligence teams had spent months infiltrating Kresh communication networks, mapping defense systems, and identifying key weaknesses. When the attack finally came, it wasn't a frontal assault. It was surgery performed with starships. Admiral Hayes coordinated the operation from the Retribution, positioned at the edge of the system where her ship's sensors could monitor everything. The attack began with cyber warfare specialists taking control of automated cargo haulers throughout the system. Within hours, ships carrying food and supplies to orbital stations were instead delivering human boarding teams and computer viruses. The Kresh tried to respond with their standard tactics, but their command structure had been compromised at every level. Orders were delayed, redirected, or simply lost in communication networks that no longer obeyed Kresh authority. Defense platforms that should have been protecting the homeworld instead turned their weapons on each other, guided by targeting data that human hackers fed directly into their fire control systems. Captain Torres led the ground assault on the Primary Command Center, a fortress built into Kelthara's largest moon. Her team moved through corridors that had been designed to stop any conceivable attack. But the Kresh had never imagined enemies who could turn their own security systems against them. Blast doors opened at human command. Automated weapons targeted Kresh defenders instead of human intruders. Environmental systems flooded sections of the base with sleeping gas that affected Kresh physiology, but left humans unharmed. The final battle took place in the depths of the fortress, where Kresh military leaders had gathered for what they thought would be their last stand. General Korvex, Supreme Commander of Dominion Forces, faced Captain Torres across a command center filled with tactical displays showing the systematic destruction of his empire. "You cannot win," Korvex said, his voice distorted by the translator. "Implant Torres War. The Dominion spans 1,000 worlds. Billions of soldiers serve our cause. You are nothing but primitives who learn to use tools they do not understand." Torres looked at the alien general with the same calm expression she had worn during every battle since Earth. "You're right about one thing. We are primitives, but we're primitives who learn from our mistakes. Your empire has been making the same mistakes for 10,000 years. The conversation ended when human soldiers stunned Korvex with weapons that had been designed by his own people's military scientists. The general would spend the rest of his life in a human detention facility, studying the tactical methods that had destroyed his civilization. His knowledge would help humanity plan the conquest of the remaining Kresh territories. Dr. Rivers walked through the archives of the Kresh homeworld with Elder Nix at her side, cataloging technologies that represented millions of years of accumulated knowledge. The Kresh had been collecting scientific data since before human ancestors had learned to make fire, and all of it was now available to human researchers. "Your people don't just win wars," Nix observed, watching human teams systematically download the contents of every computer system they could find. "You devour them completely. Nothing is wasted, nothing is forgotten." It was true. Human xenobiology teams were already studying Kresh genetic engineering techniques that could revolutionize medicine. Human physicists were analyzing gravitic manipulation technology that would make the next generation of human starships faster than anything currently in space. Human military strategists were studying the organizational methods that had held the Dominion together for millennia, learning how to rule an empire that spanned dozens of star systems. But the most important discovery was in the deepest vaults of the Kresh archives, complete intelligence files on every species the Dominion had encountered in 10,000 years of expansion. Defense capabilities, technological levels, political structures, and economic systems for hundreds of civilizations scattered throughout the galaxy. Many of those species still existed, either as Kresh client states or as independent systems that had managed to avoid Dominion attention. All of them were about to learn that the galaxy's balance of power had shifted permanently. The first diplomatic contacts began 6 months after Kelthara's fall. Human ambassadors arrived at worlds that had lived in fear of Kresh expansion for centuries, carrying proposals that seemed too good to be true, technology-sharing agreements, mutual defense pacts, economic partnerships that would benefit both species. The catch, of course, was that humanity expected something in return. The Alterran Confederacy was the first to accept human terms. Their world was rich in rare metals that human shipbuilders needed, but they lacked the military strength to defend themselves from Kresh retaliation. The deal was simple. Altera would provide raw materials and manufacturing capacity. In exchange, human fleets would protect their system from any Kresh counterattack. Similar agreements followed with dozens of other species. The humans weren't conquering these worlds. They were incorporating them into a growing alliance that combined the best technologies and capabilities of multiple civilizations. Where the Kresh had ruled through fear and superior firepower, humanity offered partnership and mutual benefit. Of course, refusing human partnership had consequences. The Torcan Empire made the mistake of attempting to negotiate with both humanity and the remnants of the Kresh Dominion. Their leaders thought they could play both sides, accepting human technology while secretly providing intelligence to Kresh military commanders. The deception lasted exactly 3 weeks before human intelligence services discovered the double dealing. Shakper. Torcan homeworld surrendered without firing a shot when 12 human warships appeared in their system. The Emperor, who had thought himself clever enough to manipulate both sides, found himself replaced by a provisional government that was much more cooperative with human interests. Colonel Martinez stood in his quarters aboard the Vengeance, reviewing intelligence reports from the expanding human sphere of influence. Each conquered system provided new information about Kresh capabilities and weaknesses. Each new alliance brought additional resources and technologies that made humanity stronger. Pattern was becoming clear. The Kresh Dominion was collapsing not just from military defeat, but from the systematic loss of everything that had made their empire possible. Client species were switching sides. Supply lines were being disrupted. Most importantly, the fear that had held their empire together for millennia was being replaced by something else. Hope. Species that had been enslaved or terrorized by the Kresh for centuries were learning that their oppressors could be defeated. Rebellions spread from world to world as human advisors provided weapons, training, and tactical support to anyone willing to fight for their freedom. The galaxy was changing, and humanity was the catalyst. Not through conquest in the traditional sense, but through a combination of military excellence, technological innovation, and political sophistication that no single species had ever achieved. Dr. Rivers received the final casualty reports from the Kelthera campaign while working in her laboratory aboard the Retribution. Human losses had been minimal, as usual. 6 ships damaged, 2 destroyed, 47 crew members killed. The Kresh had lost their homeworld, their government, and over 3 million military personnel. The mathematics of the conflict were becoming clear. Every battle made humanity stronger while weakening their enemies. Every victory provided new resources and new allies. Every defeat suffered by the Kresh convinced more species that the Dominion could be overthrown. But the most important factor was something that couldn't be quantified in after-action reports or strategic assessments. Humanity had proven that they could absorb punishment, learn from their mistakes, and become stronger than anything that tried to destroy them. The galaxy was vast, filled with ancient empires and powerful species that had ruled star systems for millions of years. All of them were watching humanity's expansion with growing concern, trying to understand how a species that had achieved spaceflight less than a century ago was systematically dismantling a civilization that had dominated the galaxy for 10 millennia. The answer was simple, though few alien species would recognize it until too late. Humans didn't just fight wars. They evolved through them, becoming something new and more dangerous with every conflict. The age of human expansion was no longer coming. It had arrived, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same. 5 years had passed since a broken alien starship fell from Earth's sky, and the galaxy barely recognized itself. The spiral arm that had once belonged to the Kresh Dominion was now marked on star charts as the Terran sphere of influence. Dozens of worlds flew human flags alongside their own, and trade routes that had carried Kresh tribute for millennia now transported human goods and ideas across hundreds of star systems. Fleet Admiral Torres stood in the command center of New Geneva Station, watching the construction of humanity's newest dreadnought through reinforced viewports that stretched across an entire wall. The shipyard was built inside a hollowed-out asteroid, using Kresh excavation technology combined with human engineering principles to create the most advanced ship construction facility in known space. The vessel taking shape in the construction bay was unlike anything that had ever been built before. The inevitability combined technologies from 17 different species, each system carefully integrated and improved by human engineers who had spent years studying alien science. Her hull was forged from Alteran metals reinforced with Kresh composite armor. Her weapons were based on Valeth energy projection theory enhanced with torque and targeting computers. Her engines used gravitic manipulation principles that the humans had discovered in the archives of 3 different conquered civilizations. But the most impressive thing about the inevitability was not her technology. It was what she represented. Humanity had gone from building crude chemical rockets to constructing ships that could destroy planets in less than a decade. The species that had once struggled to reach their own moon was now building vessels that could fold space itself. Dr. Emma Rivers walked through the memorial garden built around the crater where the Valeth ship had first crashed. The Australian outback had been transformed into the administrative center of human space operations, with government buildings and research facilities spreading out from the original crash site in all directions. But the crater itself had been preserved exactly as it was, filled with flowering plants from a dozen different worlds and marked by a simple monument that read, "Where It All Began." Elder Nix found her there, as she did most evenings when both of them couldn't sleep. The old Valeth had chosen to remain on Earth rather than accept resettlement on one of the 12 worlds that had been offered to her people. She said she wanted to watch what humanity became, to see how the species that had inherited her people's war would shape the galaxy's future. "I've been reading the intelligence reports from the Outer Rim," Nix said, settling onto a bench that overlooked the memorial crater. "Your exploration fleets have made contact with the hegemony," Rivers nodded. The hegemony was an alliance of ancient species that controlled the galaxy's core systems, civilizations that were old when the Kresh were still learning to build starships. They had watched humanity's expansion with growing concern, sending diplomatic missions that were really intelligence-gathering operations. "What do they want?" Rivers asked. "The same thing every established power wants when faced with something new and dangerous," Nix replied. "They want to contain you before you become too strong to stop." It was inevitable, Rivers supposed. Humanity had grown too quickly and achieved too much for the galaxy's existing powers to ignore. The hegemony controlled over 1,000 star systems and had military forces that dwarfed anything humans had built so far. If they decided that humanity was a threat that needed to be eliminated, the war that followed would make the conflict with the Kresh look like a minor border skirmish. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Rivers was content to sit in the big garden and remember how all of this had started. A single desperate ship carrying the last survivors of a dying empire. Refugees who had expected to die forgotten on a primitive world at the edge of nowhere. Instead, they had given humanity the tools to reshape the galaxy. The transformation hadn't been limited to military technology. Human society itself had evolved to meet the challenges of ruling an interstellar empire. The old national governments of Earth still existed, but they now answered to the Terran Council, a body that included representatives from every human, colony, and allied species. Admiral Hayes served as the Council's military advisor, coordinating defense policies across dozens of star systems. The woman who had once commanded a single rebuilt alien ship now oversaw fleets that could project human power across half the galaxy. Her strategic planning had evolved from simple ship-to-ship combat to the complex logistics of maintaining order across multiple civilizations. Captain Martinez commanded the Vengeance on patrol missions that took him to the edge of human space, where first contact protocols were being written in real time. Every month brought encounters with new species, some friendly, some hostile, all of them trying to understand how humans had become so powerful so quickly. The answer was visible everywhere in human space. Unlike the Kresh, who had ruled through fear and overwhelming force, humanity governed through integration and improvement. Alien technologies weren't just copied, they were studied, enhanced, and combined with human innovations to create something better than either species could have achieved alone. The shipyards around Earth produced vessels that incorporated design principles from 24 different civilizations. Human colonies used agricultural techniques learned from forest worlds, mining methods developed on desert planets, and manufacturing processes discovered in the ruins of extinct empires. Each advancement was shared freely throughout human space, creating a network of knowledge and capability that grew stronger with every addition. But the real key to human success was something that most alien species found difficult to understand. Humans didn't just conquer their enemies. They learned from them, absorbed their knowledge, and used their own methods against them. Where other species saw defeat as failure, humans saw it as education. Where other species feared change, humans embraced it as opportunity. The Kresh Dominion had fallen because they had tried to fight humanity using tactics that had worked for 10,000 years. The species they had conquered throughout their history had all made the same mistake, attempting to match Kresh strength instead of exploiting Kresh weaknesses. Humanity had taken a different approach. They had studied their enemies, identified their vulnerabilities, and struck where it would do the most damage. More importantly, they had learned from every battle, using each victory to prepare for the next challenge. The result was an empire that grew stronger with every conflict instead of weaker. Human forces didn't just defeat their enemies, they absorbed everything useful from conquered civilizations and incorporated it into their own growing capabilities. Each new species that joined the Terran sphere brought technologies, perspectives, and capabilities that made humanity more adaptable and more dangerous. Dr. Rivers received a communication from Admiral Hayes as she sat in the memorial garden, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. The message was brief but significant. Long-range sensors had detected ships approaching from the direction of hegemony space. Large ships, moving in formation, clearly military in nature. "How long before they arrive?" Rivers asked when Hayes appeared on her personal communicator. 6 months, maybe 8. Long enough to prepare, but not long enough to build any significant new forces. Rivers looked up at the stars, knowing that somewhere among them, ancient civilizations were making decisions that would determine humanity's future. The hegemony had ruled the galaxy's core for longer than human civilization had existed. Their technology was advanced beyond current human understanding, their fleets numbered in the millions, and their experience with warfare stretched back to before Earth's sun had formed, but they had never faced humans before. "What are your recommendations?" Rivers asked. Hayes was quiet for a moment, considering options that would have been unthinkable just 5 years earlier. "We continue building ships, training crews, and integrating new technologies. But most importantly, we study everything. We can find about hegemony tactics and capabilities. If they want a war, we'll give them one they'll never forget." Elder Nix listened to the conversation with the detached interest of someone who had already seen her own civilization rise and fall. "Your species never learns to stop, does it?" she said when the communication ended. "Would you want us to?" Rivers asked. The old Valeth considered the question while looking at the monument that marked the place where her people's final ship had fallen. Her empire was gone, her worlds were ash, and only a few hundred of her kind remained alive in the entire galaxy. But the knowledge they had carried, the technology they had developed, and the war they had fought lived on in human hands. "No," Nick said finally. "I think I want to see what happens when someone tries to break humanity and fails. It should be quite educational." In the shipyards above Earth, construction crews worked around the clock to complete the inevitability. And her sister ships. In laboratories throughout human space, scientists analyzed intelligence data about hegemony technology and military doctrine. In training facilities on a dozen worlds, human officers studied the tactics that had allowed ancient civilizations to maintain order across thousands of star systems. Humanity was preparing for its greatest challenge yet. The species that had learned to survive by adapting to every threat they encountered was about to face enemies who had been perfecting the art of warfare since before humans had discovered fire. The outcome was far from certain, but one thing was already clear to anyone who understood human nature. The galaxy's established powers had made the same mistake as everyone else who had underestimated humanity. They had given humans time to prepare. And when humans had time to prepare, they always found a way to turn their enemies' strengths into weaknesses. The age of human expansion was about to enter its next phase. Whether that would mean peaceful coexistence with the galaxies, ancient powers, or total war that would reshape civilization itself remained to be seen. But somewhere in the memorial garden built around an alien crash site, an old Valeth warrior smiled as she contemplated the irony of what her people's final gift had unleashed upon the galaxy. They had come to Earth seeking sanctuary, and instead had created the most dangerous species the universe had ever seen. Dangerous not because humans were stronger or smarter than their enemies, but because they never stopped learning, never stopped adapting, and never accepted defeat as anything more than temporary setback. The stars were vast, filled with ancient empires and powerful civilizations that had ruled their domains for millions of years. All of them were about to discover what the Kresh had learned too late. When you tried to break humanity, they didn't just rebuild themselves. They rebuilt everything.